Hello, everyone. My name is Brian Mateo, and I serve as Director of Education and Special Projects at Carnegie Council. To begin, I'd like to welcome you all to our fifth event in the Council's Ethics Empowered Leadership and Practice series, which convenes scholars and practitioners to discuss pressing moral issues, reflect on their careers, and offer insights to young leaders. In today's panel, we will be exploring the topic of space in relation to ethical questions of governance, militarization, and emerging technology. It is my pleasure to now introduce our moderator for this event, Maya Cross, Dean's Professor of Political Science, International Affairs, and Diplomacy, and Director of the Center for International Affairs and World Cultures at Northeastern University. We're also honored to welcome our panelists, Marianne Ritterwald, Research Professor at Arena Center for European Studies, alongside Anne C. Thresher, Assistant Professor of Philosophy and Religion and Public Policy and Urban Affairs at Northeastern University, and Corey L. Trusty, Colonel in the U.S. Space Force and Military Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Before I pass the microphone to Maya, a reminder that towards the end of the program, we will have a brief Q&A with the panelists. Please submit your questions to our panelists via the chat feature. Following the event, our team will publish the full event as a video, podcast, and transcript, alongside additional educational resources and discussion questions that can be leveraged in the classroom. As I join you from the Council's Global Ethics Hub in New York City, I want to welcome you again and will now pass the program over to Maya.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm delighted to be moderating today's conversation for Carnegie Council on why space matters and how to govern it. I think these questions really touch on one of the most consequential policy arenas of our time. But let me start with something that I think often gets lost in the policy weeds. Space has long inspired us as humans. There's something about looking up at the moon, the stars, a rocket soaring through the sky that really cuts across cultures, languages, and political systems. And remarkably, this sense of shared wonder has actually translated into something real. So, even at the height of the Cold War, when the United States and the Soviet Union were locked in intense rivalry, they still found ways to cooperate in space. And this practice has held over time. So, if we look at the example of the International Space Station, it's been continuously inhabited for over 2 decades with astronauts and cosmonauts living side by side, working on science and exploration. And they've done this alongside wars, sanctions, diplomatic crises on the ground below. So, space in a unique way has shown a remarkable capacity to remain somewhat insulated from the worst of our earthly conflicts. And in some ways, it may be one of the most underappreciated achievements in the history of international relations. Space today is also increasingly the infrastructure of daily life. We rely every day on GPS to get from one place to another, for weather forecasts, and even for the financial transactions that are happening right now across global markets. So, all of it depends on satellites orbiting overhead. Really, if you think about it, space is woven into the fabric of modern civilization and in ways that most of us never notice. But it really means that what happens up there in orbit or further away is really deeply consequential for all of us down here. And the landscape is changing very rapidly. Over 90 countries now have some form of national space program. The commercial sector has become a major force as well. It's not just SpaceX that everyone's aware of, but a growing constellation of literally thousands of startups spread across the world. And the space economy is growing rapidly as well. In 2024, it hit 613 billion US dollars. It's projected again to cross the threshold of $1 trillion by the early 2030s. And there are so many players and questions about how to govern space, so many actors involved. Who makes the rules? Who enforces them? Who gets left out? All of this is incredibly urgent. And that also brings us to much harder questions. So, space has long been militarized. Militaries rely on satellites for communication, navigation, surveillance. It has not yet, though, been weaponized. No nation has placed actual weapons in orbit designed specifically to target Earth or another space based asset. And I think this distinction really matters enormously. Because if we cross this line, it shatters a kind of taboo that has held for over 6 decades. And so today we're going to hear about the risks, but also the diplomatic tools available and frameworks that exist to keep that line from being crossed into a sort of vision of space as the next battlefield. We'll also turn to some of the ethical dimensions that are often overlooked. Who benefits from space? Whose interests get centered? What do we owe to future generations and to life on Earth right now? As we make decisions about resource extraction in space, biotech, the growing problem of orbital debris, these are key questions. So I'm really delighted to have our panelists dive straight into to answering some of these major dilemmas, and they are truly outstanding panelists who bring perspectives from international relations, security, and ethics. Um, so I will present the kickoff question that will be addressed to all three of them, a very big question, which is why should space matter to the general public? And we'll start with Mariana Rittervold, who will give us that perspective I mentioned from international relations. Mariana?
Okay, thank you, Maya, and good morning, or actually good afternoon from Oslo to everyone. Thank you very much for having me today for this very topical and important discussion. Well, you already mentioned some of the reasons why it's important to the general public, Maya, because as you said, space has become core critical infrastructure on Earth. You also mentioned, climate, weather forecast, navigation, trade and finance. Everything we do literally depend on the functioning space capabilities in low Earth orbit and also in what we call kind of middle Earth orbit. And from a security and defense perspective, these space capacities are also key. I would say that actually no other domains, whether it's sea, air, Earth, or military, regular conventional forces, can do without functioning space capabilities. And as you also mentioned, it has really been key to scientific developments on Earth, of course. And it is a global commons, so it actually belongs to all of us. What happens there is up to all of us to decide, so to speak. So the problem, and I'm sure we will discuss this more, is that there are relatively few regulations in space. That hasn't really been a big problem previously because space wasn't really that accessible. So it is technological developments that have driven this kind of use of space capabilities on Earth, and also the reason why we see so many different actors now, technological companies, different states, etc., using space for different types of earthly needs, and also starting to compete in space exploration. So many different states are going to the moon, for example, or discussing how to regulate international regulations on other planets, for example. So the problem now is that we see this huge increase, for example, in satellites. We had like 900,000 satellites in 2010. Now there's about, 11,000 or something, 10,000. And many ESA, NASA, they expect the number of satellites to increase to 100,000 by 2030. So there's not enough room for all of these satellites. So it's becoming more contested, congested, and also more conflictual as great power conflict also increasingly plays into space, especially space exploration. Not necessarily from the United States perspective, for example, it's not necessarily about dominating space, but it's very important for the United States that China doesn't get stronger or more influential in space, for example. So we have all of these different things playing out. It's becoming very congested. It's becoming more conflictual, while we at the same time have a few regulations, which is why it is so important that we find ways of regulating and organizing this domain together. And all of these things matter. It's a critical infrastructure, it's a global common, and what happens out there for geopolitically is also super important to all of us.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mariana, for explaining the international landscape. Ansi, if I could move to you and ask the same question from an ethical perspective, why should space matter to the general public?
Yeah, I mean, to add to what you've said and what Mariana said, we're all using space increasingly. Everyone sort of on this call probably has used space in the last 24 hours, not just for like navigating to wherever you're heading for in your car, but for banking is a big one people don't realize is core to our projects associated with space. Almost every time you use an ATM or pay for something with your bank card, you're using space infrastructure. It's important for communications. It's increasingly important for communications. Our access to phone calls, to the internet, these things are starting to become routed via space. And so that means that we all have a serious invested interest in space right now. In terms of making sure that we have equal access, it becomes a justice issue. Access to things like money and communication are something that are core to all of our goals and projects here on Earth. And so that means we need to be thinking more about what we're going to do in space and how we're going to govern it, how we're going to exist in it, and how we're going to expand into it. So one thing I think about a lot is the fact that the way we start in space is likely to be the way that we go on. And we need to think carefully about whether that's going to be a Wild West model, where it's sort of private industry, every man for himself, or whether we're going to treat it as a place of global goods. We work together to try and build space up in this area, a cooperative area for all of us. And the choices we make now are going to set us on certain paths. And we need to think really carefully about who is going to benefit from space, whether that's going to be government actors, private industry, science. And as Marianne points out, there's limited resources in space, or there's limited resources and there's limited space in space. We often think of space as very big, but low Earth orbit is becoming increasingly crowded. We're going to start making choices about how those regions are being used and what we prioritize. Is it a place of science? It's a critical resource for climate monitoring, for example. Is it a place for industry? If so, how should those industries influence other things on Earth? We're already seeing groups like SpaceX having outsized influences on wars here on Earth. Or is it a place of the military, right? We're seeing more and more groups agitating for space as the domain of war. And we need to think carefully now about what those choices are. It's also the case that there are longer term questions. Space exacerbates a lot of the problems we see here on Earth. If we're worried about ethical issues associated with employment, for example, or access to basic resources, those become much harder to deal with somewhere like the moon, or when you're in orbit, where you're entirely at the mercy of other groups for the air you breathe or the food you eat. And so it's important to think carefully and proactively about exactly the things we're talking about here, like legal structures and protections for certain groups, but also just who we want to be as a species as we move off Earth. If space is our future, we need thinking now about what it is we want to bring off Earth that is positive and what we want to leave behind here as we move towards a future off planet.
Great. Thank you, Ansi. And Corey, how about the security perspective?
Yeah, no, thank you. I appreciate it. Thanks. I'm super glad to be here, especially with all the esteemed panelists. I think everybody's made some great points because, when you think about it, most Americans, when they hear space, they think about, the astronauts, they think about rockets, and indeed they do think about exploration. But, from that national security perspective, space isn't a distant frontier. It's a critical infrastructure. It underpins the way, our society functions every single day. And you guys are right. When you look at, GPS or weather satellites and communication satellites, if those systems were disrupted, the effects wouldn't be abstract or distant. That would ripple through our economy and our daily lives almost immediately. And so from a military standpoint, space is even more foundational. Modern warfare depends on space-enabled capabilities, missile warning, secure communications, intelligence, surveillance, and that precision navigation, as we kind of alluded to earlier. And if an adversary can blind or disrupt those systems, then they can degrade our ability to deter conflict and defend our allies. And that's without even striking the homeland directly. And so that means space is no longer just a supporting domain. It's a frontline domain of strategic competition. And importantly, space is no longer a sanctuary. Other nations have, developed anti-satellite weapons, electronic warfare capabilities, and these cyber tools designed to target space systems. And so because that domain is like you said before, is congested, is competitive, and contested, actions in space can create a long-lasting debris that threatens civilian and commercial satellites alike. And so any type of irresponsible act in orbit can affect everyone on Earth for decades. And at the same time, we're in the midst of a commercial space revolution. And so our economy is increasingly tied to private sector space capabilities. And that creates resilience and innovation, but it also raises new questions about protection, escalation, and governance. And so why should the general public care? Well, because space is really the invisible backbone of our modern life. When I first, got into this space career field, I never thought, and this was, of course, over 20 years ago, I never thought that it would underpin everything that we would do. And so because it does, enable our security, our economy, and our safety in ways that most people never see, if we fail to protect it, deter conflict in it, and establish, responsible norms for behavior, then we really risk undermining the systems that keep our society functioning. And so space matters not just because of, what's up there, but because of everything down here that really depends on it.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Corey, for explaining that. I mean, it really shows just how high the stakes are, both for today and then also, as Ansi mentioned, for our future as human beings and as we expand further into space. And on that note, I think it's worth really zooming in a bit on space governance and what is in place right now. And I'd like to start with Mariana and ask her, what are the current treaties or frameworks in place to govern outer space? And how should space diplomacy, do you think, evolve based on current challenges with the rise of other actors, non-state actors, and commercial actors? And related to that, what do you think of the Artemis Accords? And if you could explain a little bit about what those are in terms of current efforts to govern and update space frameworks.
Okay, thank you. So there are some treaties, some long-standing norms and regulations in the space domain. Most importantly, the Outer Space Treaty. There's what's sometimes referred to as the Moon Convention. There are some regulations and regimes on frequencies, for example, and there's, of course, a lot of soft law and national regulation. But there are very clear limits to this, I would say. To a very large extent, space is first come, first serve domain. So everyone can, for example, launch satellites or go to the moon or to other planets, which is also why we see this enormous increase in satellite launches both by public and private actors. So you could say, if you compare to all other areas in the world, that space is actually the closest we get to anarchy in a way, because there are so relatively few regulations compared to all other areas on Earth. And this, as Ansi mentioned, and also Corey, I mean, this raises all these important ethical questions regarding how then can we develop space as a just and sustainable common, right? And so there is no other way than finding global regimes, developing common regulations, and there's an urgent need for this, precisely because of this first come, first serve principle. And there's literally no other way either, because you can't really divide space territorially. So you have the only way to govern it, and that would be also in everyone's self-interest, because if low Earth orbit becomes too crowded, the satellites at some point will be useless, worst case scenario. But this has, of course, proven difficult because there are many strong economic interests. There is geopolitical conflicts playing out. We all know that we live in a difficult world when it comes to global cooperation. But one of the things, but there are some actors that are starting to kind of build on what's already there and trying to build cooperation. In some UN institutions, there actually is cooperation, for example, on frequencies or mega constellations, etc. Even if one wouldn't expect that, given the kind of anarchical structures of space. As you also mentioned, Maya, there's actually been cooperation in space through the Cold War as well, even if so much more is needed now because there are so many more actors there. But the Artemis Accords, it's a set of non-binding principles that was launched by NASA in coordination with the United States. I think it was in 2020. And it's the idea is to kind of build on the Outer Space Treaty and other, like the Moon Agreement, no treaty, etc., to develop some common norms for how to deal with outer space. And it's been signed by more than 60 states. Most European states have signed, for amongst others. And there are different views on this, but I think that even if it's not fully global, and it builds on the Outer Space Treaty, so it builds on some of the core norms that we already have. And we know from other areas, like regulation of the high seas or the airspace, that one important step towards more regulation could actually be by groups of states or clubs, that we sometimes call them in international relations, suggesting some norms, developing and trying to push these forwards also within international arenas. So I think it's a good thing that we develop some common norms, that states cooperate, and then of course the challenge is to make this applicable beyond these states and actually develop binding rules and regulations around them. Another example, and I'm not going to go into detail on that, is that the EU is also trying to use its so-called Brussels effect, or like regulating at least some aspects of low Earth orbit, for example, space debris, through its Space Act that came out recently.
Thanks, Mariana. And Corey, what is your perspective on the Artemis Accords and how U.S. interests are reflected in that effort? From your role in Space Force, I'm wondering, from that angle, does Space Force seek to prevent conflict in space with initiatives like the Artemis Accords?
Yeah, thank you for that. So, I mean, the Artemis Accords, they represent something, strategically significant. It's really an effort to try to shape the rules of the road before competition hardens into conflict. At their core, the Artemis Accords are about transparency, interoperability, peaceful use, and the responsible behavior in space exploration. They really reinforce principles, embedded in that outer space treaty, like Miriam was talking about before. There's non-appropriation, there's peaceful purposes, there's due regard for others, but they also address some of the modern realities like resource utilization or deconfliction of activities, and the sharing of scientific data, which is all very critical and important. And that's not accidental. It really reflects a distinctly American approach to international order. Open systems, rule-based frameworks, coalition building, and commercial participation. And so the U.S. interests are clearly reflected in design. First, we benefit from stability and predictability. The United States and our private sector are deeply invested in space. So having clear norms, really reduce miscalculation and protect our long-term access. Second, the Accords reinforce alliances. Instead of pursuing unilateral dominance, the U.S. is building a coalition of like-minded nations really committed to responsible behavior. And so that strengthens the legitimacy, and it really shapes the expectations about what normal conduct in space looks like. Third, they really support commercial innovation. That framework acknowledges that private actors will play a major role, in lunar and deep space activity. And it creates guardrails that enable investment while reducing friction. And so from a strategic standpoint, governance is not really separate from security. It's part of security. And so if you don't help shape the norms early, then you inherit someone else's. And so as for the Space Force, yes, we absolutely seek to prevent conflict in space. Our mission is not really to militarize Space for its own sake, but the mission is to secure U.S. and allied interests from and to space. From and to space is really what we do. And the best way to do that is through deterrence and resilience. And so deterrence is about convincing our potential adversaries that aggression will not achieve their objectives and will carry unacceptable costs. Resilience is about ensuring that even if systems are challenged, they can withstand disruption and continue to function. So conflict in space would be enormously destabilizing. And so it would create debris, and it would, affect our civilian infrastructure and then potentially a spill over into other domains. So the goal is not conflict, it's stability. And so the Space Force exists in part because space is already contested. And ignoring that really doesn't preserve peace, it invites risk. And so then we talk about why space matters and how to govern it. These issues are tightly connected. And so norm building efforts like the Artemis Accords really help establish responsible behavior and strengthen those coalitions that I was talking about earlier. And so a credible Space Force really underpins deterrence and it protects critical infrastructure. And so together with the governance and security, are not really opposing ideas. They are mutually reinforcing pillars of long-term stability in space. Now, I really have, and just before I finish, I really have to address the elephant in the room. So Russia and China's non-participation in the Artemis Accord is not merely a diplomatic choice. It's structural. And so it really signals the emergence of competing space governance regimes, alliance blocks and industrial ecosystems. None of those I think are really good for, the management of space. And so the core strategic question is whether these parallel architectures remain interoperable and peaceful, or if they harden into like adversarial spheres of influence extending to the moon and maybe even beyond. And so their absence really reflects a broader, bifurcation in the international space order, which has significant implications for, the governance of norms of space, our alliance, alignment, whether it's technology controls and even long-term access to, cislunar resources.
Great. Thank you, Corey, for that really comprehensive overview of how Space Force and militaries might approach the future and potential for conflict in space. I mean, I think it's great news that militaries do recognize, including Space Force, that conflict in space is undesirable, that it actually breeds a whole bunch of instability. There is still this kind of debate, though, whether space is the next battlefield or whether we're entering into this new era of, the flourishing of a new space age 2.0. But I think in order to kind of address that question, we have to come back to the difference between the militarization of space, which, as I said, and you have reiterated, Corey, has long existed. We are reliant on space for almost all sorts of activities on Earth, including the military. But the difference between that and weaponization of space. And Mariana, I'm hoping you could shed some light on that difference. How do you see the distinction between militarization and weaponization of space? And how do we actually prevent the explicit weaponization of space and even maybe mitigate the ongoing militarization of orbiting satellites?
Yeah, it's a very important question and it's very difficult to answer, of course, how to avoid that in today's geopolitically very difficult environment. And Corey also discussed that already, right? That is what we really have to try to avoid. But the way I understand the difference is that militarization of space more or less just means the kind of military use of space capabilities and services and data. And in this sense, space is almost per definition militarized because most space capabilities are dual use, which means that they can be used both for civilian or military purposes. So we use, the same type of navigation systems are used by the shipping fleets and by the defense forces, for example, or we use surveillance data to monitor the weather, climate, and we use the same kind of data to monitor for surveillance purposes, for example, also linked to military conflict. And we've seen that very clearly now, for example, in Ukraine with the use of Starlink systems, by both parties actually in the war. But the weaponization of space, the way I understand it, is that means that you actually deploy weapons in space, or you deploy weapons in space that you use on Earth, or you have weapons that you can use against other space objects. And then there is some disagreement on whether or not the use, for example, we've used space capacities for jamming, spoofing, cyber attacks, etc., whether that is weaponization or militarization. But we really want to avoid weaponization, of course, because it's it's not legal according to international space law, but it's also very dangerous in itself, of course, because I mean, weapons are dangerous, but it's also dangerous in the sense that it will create these kind of security dilemma situations where you have one actor weaponizing space, then the other actors responding to that, and you will very soon see a kind of spiraling armament in space. And it could also have damaging impacts on Earth, on the kind of terror balance or the nuclear balance we have on Earth, because now, or at least the realist argument would be that the reason why there hasn't been nuclear war is because we have mutual deterrence capacities. If you have weapons in space that can interrupt this, that is also very dangerous on Earth, which is because it would kind of render response strikes impossible in a sense. And that is something everyone is very aware of now, also with developments, of course, in the United States programs, for example. But it's this, and we are not sure whether or not Russia already has done so. If it has weaponized space already, that is a big discussion. But I think also, how can we avoid this? Well, of course, international cooperation, regulations, it's in everyone's interest because we don't want to get into this situation. But it's also important how we talk about this, like you say, Maya, which is also a key reason why we should discuss the difference, because if we act as if other states have weaponized space, we will also more easily do it ourselves and create these kind of security debts. So, and also then establishing arenas for discussions and knowledge exchange, scientific knowledge on what is going on, expert knowledge, but most importantly, of course, international cooperation to avoid this.
Absolutely.
But there's no easy solution. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely a challenge and something that space diplomacy could help address. But yeah, I definitely agree with your point about the danger of self-fulfilling prophecies. If we talk about space as already a battlefield, as already weaponized, then you sort of give away the high ground of trying to preserve it as a peaceful domain for all of humankind. And that kind of
space diplomacy has actually worked before.
It has.
I mean, it is possible.
Yeah, and that segues very nicely to bringing Ansi back in on how we should center space ethics around Earth-related issues to prioritize life on Earth. Rather than prioritizing things like weaponization of space, or even, as some would talk about it, colonizing Mars. Ansi, what would you add in terms of the ethical framing of this?
Yeah, I mean, I think everything that Marianne brings up is really important. I'll add on top of that when we talk about self-fulfilling prophecies, when we talk about space as a domain of war and weapons, not just militarization, I think it also changes the way we use and think about space. You don't need to fire the weapons or have a space war for people to be reluctant to invest in infrastructure in space when they think of it as a place of potential conflict, right? I like to think of it as the kinds of shops you get when you're building a mall in an active military zone is very different than the kinds you get somewhere like downtown Boston, right? And so just talking about space as the domain of war, as a place that we are actively thinking of putting weapons, changes the kinds of projects and the benefits we're going to get out of it. It's just going to change the way industry thinks about space. And so we need to be really careful about the way that language is rolled out and how much we're advocating for these kinds of things if we want to make sure that we're getting the full benefits out of space for those of us sort of not involved in the large military conflicts. On top of that, I'll add, it's also often really hard to tell the line between militarization and weaponization. Marianne brought up things like spoofing. I think that's a really good example where it's really unclear whether this is military or weapon in space. But there's also things like, look, we have a lot of satellites in orbit, sort of come up already. We have and last I looked, about 8,000 to 9,000 objects in space orbiting us. And I think, as Marianne said earlier, we're looking about 100,000 by 2030. And like, A significant portion of those are just the ones being reported by groups like SpaceX. We're not including a lot of ones by groups like China or Russia or emerging economies and groups that are starting to go into space the first time will start to get into space over the next decade. We're going to see an exponential rise in objects in space, which is great. Again, infrastructure, industry, we're seeing benefits from these sorts of things. But it also means we need to be able to get these satellites down again. We've seen tests of groups trying to, I think the Japanese have got these satellites with little nets. They're trying to sort of like capture satellites to pull them out again that thus they stop working, or Europe's investigating different ways of like removing and decommissioning satellites. Again, really important because you need to be able to take these things down afterwards because there's not that much actual low Earth orbit space. And so you need to make sure you've got access to as much as possible. But that crosses into weaponization, right? Like the kinds of things that'll let you take out an old satellite are also the kinds of things that'll let you take out an enemy satellite. And so it's really unclear when we're going to cross that line, and it's a very blurry thing to think about. And so we need to be really proactive about the governance issues and what we mean by it in order to make sure that we're not sort of almost accidentally or with the excuse of maintaining space, for everyone, sort of slipping through a lot of weapons. And so I think it's really important to think proactively about these problems. You asked about things like how do we center space ethics? Well, look, like we've got to be thinking proactively now about what hard lines we're setting, what cooperations. Corey brought up the fact that we're seeing these solidification of certain political treaties and political groupings. Those are going to have long-term implications, not just for how space looks, but for back here on Earth. Which industries get to benefit off of space? Where do those benefits go to? Who benefits from them, right? Is it sort of space takes a lot of money and energy and time, and that's going to naturally limit the kinds of people that can access the resources of space and profit off of it. And so we might see, even more so than in the last few decades, this exacerbation of certain groups making huge amounts of money and becoming immensely powerful. And if we don't want these monopolies emerging, if we don't want these groups to have control over the very real and tangible projects that we, everyday person, has on Earth, we need to think very carefully about how we're going to regulate and monitor these things. Even beyond weapons, we need to think about what does it look like to do business somewhere like space. I think space is exciting. Space is amazing. Like it's a very cool and interesting domain. We get very worked up about things like colonizing Mars and settling on the moon. And we should. It's an incredible opportunity for us as a species. The fact that we live at the time when we're seriously contemplating what it looks like to become an interplanetary species is amazing. But we've got to be really thoughtful about the way we're going to do that, and how it's going to impact those of us who are going to remain here and living on Earth, and what the impacts that's going to be on our society. And I'm hoping later on we can talk a little bit about the environmental impacts of space. But there are serious environmental impacts to the new space age. And we can't think about sacrificing Earth for space, even if it's a very exciting and wonderful thing.
Great. I want to make sure we have time for questions as well. But Ansi, maybe I could just ask you to elaborate a little bit more on that kind of future of space and the ethical frameworks. And in particular, I'm thinking as commercial space becomes increasingly involved, and in particular, biotech in space. What do you think is really a priority as space exploration evolves to include longer voyages? Humans potentially live in space. We're thinking about resources, access to that, the use of biotech. I mean, it seems to open up a whole big can of worms when it comes to ethics. Could you explain a little from your perspective, space and biotech in particular, what's important to think about?
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought up biotech. I think it's one of these areas that's massively underthought about when it comes to space. Everyone thinks about infrastructure, rockets, and pollution from rocket fuel, and what does it mean to build space bases, and people are thinking very carefully about architecture on the moon, et cetera, et cetera. But few people are thinking about the biotech aspects of space, and that in many ways is a bit of an American problem. China is thinking very carefully about biotech in space, and they're, in fact, I think, ahead of us when it comes to these kinds of technologies, because it is going to be critical. And it ranges from, well, where are you getting your life support systems from? Like, how are we building and genetically modifying crops to grow somewhere like a space base or the moon or Mars? What does it mean for us to think about quarantine? between here, like on Earth, and space, right? These that most people don't realize this ISS is very moist and full of a lot of fungus. Like it's, not necessarily a pleasant place to be hanging around in, but it also means there are these like separate like evolutions happening for these biosystems, right? And so like quarantine is going to be really important between here and space. And in the longer term, you get issues like, well, space is dangerous. And I mean that sort of not in a like, well, you might get crushed by rocks while mining on Mars, but like there's a lot of radiation and a lot of other health issues associated with space. And so people are starting to think about what it might look to genetically modify humans to be better adapted to something like space. And those are sort of like big sci-fi concepts, but there's still things we need to be thinking about and setting norms for now, because they're going to be on the table over the next like several decades to 100 or so years. And all the technological advances that come from the new space age in biotech are going to come back down to Earth. And so we're going to see an acceleration of acceptance of these technologies. And again, I feel like my message here is just like, as always, the things we chose to do now change the things we're going to have access to and decide to use later, and what we normalize and how we use it. And so we need to be really thoughtful about it now, even when it seems like sci-fi concepts.
And that segues nicely to one of the first questions we've received from the audience. And this question is from Ms. Arashnelia, which is, how can international law effectively address the growing problem of space debris and ensure accountability for both private companies and nations? I think this might resonate most perhaps with Mariana's area of expertise. And we could think about beyond international law governance as well, but it really is so much about what Ansi was just talking about in terms of planning ahead. We clearly already observe the problem of space debris and the growing role of private companies. Mariana, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, and it is, of course, difficult, and it's in acute need of regulation. But there is actually discussions on these issues: debris, the launch of mega constellations like the one that Starlink launches in the UN right now, as we speak, even between the major powers of the earth, so to speak. But it's very difficult, and it's progressing rather slowly. So one of the very concrete attempts at trying to regulate this is what we see with the EU Space Act, which will regulate all companies that operate in the European market. And there are suggestions in this legal text that will have to be adopted, so it has to be approved by the member states and the European Parliament as well, where there are rules, for example, on any company operating in the European market, whether it's an American company, if it's a Chinese company, a European company, that there will be rules on how they also have to get rid of their space debris, for example, in order to be able to operate in this market. So that's one attempt. So I think we will see, hopefully, and that could also be linked to cooperation with other like-minded countries and states. Sorry, there's something. Where we see that in, for example, the European Union's approach in general to international law and regulations, now that international cooperation is becoming more difficult, that the EU is seeking cooperation and common rules and regulations with like-minded countries. So I think we don't know how this will work in practice, because it hasn't really been done before, but it could be a step. And if it's also includes other countries as well, it could be a step in this direction, and then also help facilitate international cooperation, because then you have some legal solutions that can then kind of travel to the international arena. But yeah.
Great, thank you. And another question that's come in is from Dr. Eric Hubbard, and I think this question could be addressed perhaps both by Ansi and Corey, but it is this question of how do ethics and morality best strategically keep a seat at the table when discussing space expansion, namely in a commercial and military dominated power environment. So maybe we could start with Ansi about the ethics and morality and how we keep those in mind when talking about these commercial and military challenges. And then if I could ask Corey to also chime in from a military perspective.
Yeah, look, I think this is a really good question because often when Marianne pointed out earlier, we're in sort of this like almost an arms race for space in space. The first people to get there tend to be the first people that have access to things, tend to be the winners. And so it can be tempting to leave a lot of the ethical principles by the wayside. We see this historically, right? Like we've not done great when it comes to moving from various regions as species and the ways we've treated local groups. We tend to forget about the ethics or deprioritize it in the name of profit or military security. And I think we need to be really careful to not let that happen in space. We need to be learning from past mistakes and moving forward with sort of eyes wide open about the way that we want to be and who we want to be as a species when we move off planet. And we need to think strategically about how to make sure ethics is at the table. In some cases, that means just talking to your local ethicist. But it also can mean things like ethics training for people who are going into space areas, right? I teach a lot of classes on ethics. And I often tell my students, and I tell people in industry when I work with them, I tell people in the government when I work with them, your job is not to be an ethics expert. Your job is to know enough that you know when to call in the experts to have those conversations, right? We have an ethical obligation towards the people around us, towards everyone else on Earth. And there are experts around. We just need to treat them as experts who can be called in to have exactly these kinds of conversations we're having right now. And that can be hard and it can be uncomfortable because often people think ethicists is going to come in and just criticize you for being bad people. And that's not our job. Our job is to tell you how to positively interact with the world around you and help make sure that justice issues aren't being exacerbated and that the way we're operating is fair and kind and thoughtful. But, there's only so many ways we can manage that. You still have to be invited to the table to sit there. And that could be a really hard thing. And so strategically, you've got to think carefully about who you're talking to and how we're walking forward. And a lot of that comes down to people who are on this Zoom, right? Like people that are interested in space, who are interested in the future of humanity in space. And if you're interested in those sorts of things, keep in mind these ethical questions and the real ethical implications of this domain. And when in doubt, call in your local ethicist.
Great, Nancy. And Corey, I thought maybe I'd bring in an earlier question I almost posed to you, but I wanted to go to audience questions as well. But when you think of this from a military perspective and the key risks in mind, especially if we consider activities of Russia and China, the risk that they may be placing or have already potentially placed space-based weapons in orbit, how does Space Force, and from your perspective, militaries in general, how do they respond to this? Is ethics and morality part of that response, or is it simply, a straightforward matter of this is a military strategic risk, we need to respond in kind?
Yeah, no, thanks for that question. And I think from a military space perspective, I mean, at least for the U.S. Space Force, I mean, ethics and morality, I mean, it remains relevant in everything that we do as far as when we reinforce. I mean, it's kind of in our mission, that we want to, kind of protect the domain, in from and to space. Like that is our kind of chartered mission for us to do. And so we want to reinforce strategic stability, operational safety, and then as well as like long-term access to the domain. And so embedding responsible conduct and transparency and stewardship into our doctrine, into our international norms, it helps prevent like miscalculation. It helps prevent conflict escalation, as well as any type of degradation to critical space assets. And so ethical standards, they strengthen our legitimacy in us and in our alliances. And so we use that as really a kind of a force multiplier, for us to compete in a contested environment. And so in this way, our morality is really not separate from our strategy. It supports the resilience, the deterrence, and the sustained freedom of action in space.
Great. Thank you, Corey. And I have another question here from Henrik Seiss, a philosopher and space historian in Norway. And he writes, given the very difficult and conflictual geopolitical atmosphere between China and the US, and certainly Russia, what role can and should other major space powers, such as Europe, Japan, India, play in strengthening the ambitions and norms towards space collaboration found in the Outer Space Treaty? And I think Mariana already illustrated, what Europe is doing, and particularly the European Space Agency. Um, do you have any insights on countries beyond Europe, or who are interacting more globally in terms of trying to de-escalate the conflictual geopolitical atmosphere? Mariana?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And we also see that in the UN setting, for example, that countries like, the European Union member states, sorry, the Canada, for example, Japan, they are all very active in trying to kind of facilitate international cooperation in space. And in this kind of new multipolar world, where the middle powers need to stand up and join forces and try to kind of protect as much international cooperation, international regulation as one could. I think that space, what I've seen at least is that space is actually part of these discussions. For example, between the European Union and Japan, both the space agencies, the European Space Agency, but which is not part of the European Union, just to make it even more confusing. But the space agencies cooperate very, very closely, which is also very important because they play into decision makers or policy making. They play into international negotiations, but also at the political level, there is also space cooperation between, for example, the EU, Canada, the EU, India, and EU, Japan, for example. And I think that's very important. And I think that's also something that these states are very well aware of. And if you're able to regulate companies, for example, that operate on these countries, so you would actually regulate at least a lot of what goes on in low Earth orbit, even if outer space is then a different question.
Great. Thank you, Mariana. And I have a question from Ivan, a student from Uzhhorod National University in Ukraine. The question is, how should we ethically evaluate dual-use space technologies, where the same satellite infrastructure can support both civilian welfare and military targeting? And maybe, of course, Ansi as the ethicist here. And then I'll also ask Corey, because of this question of how do we understand the risks and respond to dual-use space technologies that have both civilian and military potential purposes. Ansi?
Yeah, this is a very good and complicated question. Basically, everything is dual use, right? Like a hammer is an important tool for building, but it can also be used to kill someone. And so like dual use becomes this really fraught question from an ethics perspective. At what point do you regulate? At what point do you manage? And at what point do you ban something because it is too risky as a dual use technology? And I don't think I have good, clear answers. A lot of it's going to be very context-based, right? Like we need to be able to remove satellites from orbit. The standard way right now is by burning them up in the upper atmosphere. You just deorbit them and let them burn up. But recent studies have shown that about 20% of the particles in the upper atmosphere now are remnants of satellites. We're essentially starting to change the albedo of the upper atmosphere with satellite debris. It's plastics and metals and so forth. And like, that's a very bad plan, right? We do not know what the long-term repercussions of that are. We're essentially accidentally geoengineering our upper atmosphere right now. And so that's not a viable option anymore. And so we need to be thinking about ways to manage, mitigate, and remove satellites. We can't just sort of ban the technology altogether. And so we end up in this weird place where we need to start thinking about how to regulate the way people can use these things, or kinds of deorbiting technologies to get put in space. But there's sort of no clean and easy way. The answer is to throw things back to Marianne and Corey. It's going to be regulation, right? We have to think very carefully about the way that we like allow people to use these things, because we can't ban a lot of these things. Now, it comes differently when it's things like nuclear orbit or nuclear weapons in space, which, like, as far as no one's actually talking about, it's not a like good logistics to put nuclear weapons in space. You have to maintain them a lot. But you know, like, there are clear lines and there are these blurry lines. It's really hard to figure out what to do about those blurry line spaces. And so, yeah, I think unfortunately the answer just becomes we have to be more proactive about the way we regulate and understand these things. And that requires international understandings, because one of the problems of space is that everyone has access to it. You can't sort of bottleneck it in the way you might with other things. And so everyone has to sign on to these things, or we're just going to see sort of either rogue actors, or, if somewhere like India refuses to regulate, a lot of the industries are going to move to India because they're going to have better access and like less regulation on top of these things. So like there's a lot of complexities here that I don't have good answers beyond, yeah, I think we have to throw this back to the regulation people to figure out.
And I think if I may just jump in there just really quickly, and I understand why this question comes from Ukraine, because we see this all the time, right? That you have the Ukrainian society being so dependent on critical infrastructure developed and provided by private actors, because I also think that this thing, the fact that so many of these capabilities are owned by private actors that are not really regulated, that makes a huge difference from having publicly owned critical infrastructure in space. And what we see in Ukraine is that you rely so much on the capabilities provided by Starlink, but at the same time we also see that, for example, Russia also uses the same capabilities when they in their kind of warfare against Ukraine. Right now, the last few days we've seen that Starlink has actually cut some of the access to Russian military, but that's it's kind of, everyone depends all the time on how some private actors perceive the conflict and what they are willing to do for each side. So it's super complicated. So that is absolutely something that should be discussed ethically, because the implications are so enormous. And it also goes to what at least we are trying to do in Europe. I would say that trying to regulate these companies, trying to distinguish between the public needs and the private needs, and also even having more publicly owned satellites is that is the European approach in that sense, and that is very much the reason why the EU is buying its or launching its own satellites now that can be used for communication, navigation, etc., surveillance purposes, for military purposes, is precisely linked to the experiences from Ukraine and the wish not to be dependent on private actors who are not really regulated in this domain.
Yeah, and just to close it out from my point of view, it's just so from a military space perspective, I mean, these do use space technologies. They should be evaluated through a lens of responsible use, proportionality, as well as strategic stability. Because the same satellite system can enable civilian services and military targeting. I mean, ethical assessments must consider how their employment aligns with the law of armed conflict. Minimizing harm to civilians, and then also avoiding any type of unnecessary escalation. So we got to have clear doctrine, transparency where feasible, and then we have to have restraint in targeting decisions, which helps preserve the legitimacy as well as protect critical global infrastructure. And so ultimately, the ethical evaluation ensures the military advantage. It does not undermine our long-term access, as well as alliance cohesion or stability in the space domain.
That is great. Thank you so much to the speakers for outlining your perspectives on these really critical and timely questions. And I think we learned so much from your comments about, the challenges ahead, but also the opportunities, and how we are in some ways inevitably heading towards being more of a spacefaring society. And so to think ahead, to incorporate ethical frameworks, to try to prevent the weaponization of space, even as we depend on it every single day for our infrastructure, is really crucial going forward. So I just want to thank these outstanding panelists for sharing their expertise with us today. And thank you to the audience as well for your wonderful questions. And I hope this gives you some food for thought going forward as you think about space.